They tore through your life like lightning, sudden, undeniable, holy. You didn't plan for it. You weren't ready, but your soul stood up and said, "This one." And then, just as fast, they were gone. Not dead, not evil, just unreachable. And you're left shattered, not just by the loss, but by the meaning. The worst part? No one warns you that something which never fully began can still break you. That a few conversations, a few glances, a few hours wrapped in the wrong timing can rearrange your entire interior world. You're left holding a memory that behaves like a future, and grief that refuses to follow the rules. That's where we begin, not with what happened, but with what it awoke. They didn't just arrive, they disrupted something, not dramatically, not like a movie scene with slow motion and swelling music, but in that eerie, unmistakable way a dream lingers after waking. You met them, and something primal turned toward them, like an animal scenting fire. Not fear, not quite desire. Something else, something older, recognition. You tried to keep it rational. You told yourself, it's just chemistry, projection, coincidence. But that didn't land, because when they looked at you, really looked, it felt like you were being remembered. That's what you can't explain to anyone. This wasn't attraction, it was a reunion. There was no slow build, no checklist, no calculus of compatibility. There was only the shock of intimacy, of being seen too quickly, too clearly, of someone intuiting your silence, speaking to the part of you that language usually fails to reach. It didn't matter whether the relationship was brief or even fully realized, because this wasn't about time, it was about depth. And in the days or weeks or months you shared, even in the moments, you touched something that no one else had ever found. Around them, you became someone you didn't know you still were. Bolder, softer, raw. You laughed in ways you hadn't since childhood. You said things without rehearsing. You remembered what it felt like to be present, unguarded, whole. That's the part no one sees. That when they left, they didn't just take themselves. They took you, the version of you that could only exist in their presence. And here's the cruelty. They didn't leave like a villain. They didn't betray you or destroy you. They simply couldn't stay. They had another life, another path, another obligation. Maybe they weren't ready. Maybe you weren't. Or maybe the universe, in its brutal mercy, never intended for them to stay at all. That's what haunts you. Not just the ache of missing them, but the emptiness where you used to be. You try to explain it, to friends, to a therapist, but no one really gets it because they keep trying to reduce it to a category: unrequited love, situationship, trauma bond. And maybe those labels are true in parts, but none of them account for the rupture. None of them explain how you can miss someone like you miss a place, a landscape inside yourself you didn't know existed until they walked through it. It's not just that they're gone, it's that you can't go back to who you were before them. You see, this wasn't just emotional, it was existential. They became a kind of mirror, not of who you are, but of who you could be if you stopped hiding, if you stopped settling, if you let yourself be fully known. And when that mirror disappeared, it shattered something in you, not just hope, orientation. And so you're left in this limbo, not quite grieving a person, but a possibility. Not mourning a relationship, but a revelation. And that's why it lingers, why it follows you, why the thought of them sneaks into empty moments, brushing your mind like wind through a half-open window. Not because you're obsessed, but because deep down some part of you still believes that meant something. It had to mean something, and maybe it did. Maybe they didn't come to stay. Maybe they came to awaken, to disturb the version of you that made peace with numbness, to burn down the coping strategies you called a life. Maybe they weren't the destination. Maybe they were the earthquake, and now the aftershock is yours to live through. You tell yourself it came out of nowhere, that they were a disruption in an otherwise ordinary timeline. But if you're honest, really honest, you knew something was coming. You felt it in the silence, in the aching boredom you couldn't explain, in the moments where your routines stopped feeling like safety and started feeling like entrapment. You started questioning things you had long accepted. Things like, why doesn't anything move me anymore? Why does everything feel so numb, so gray, so lifeless? These weren't just signs of discontent. They were psychic tremors, little ruptures in your carefully constructed life. Signals from the unconscious whispering that something was missing, or more precisely, that someone was coming. Carl Jung called it the anima or animus, the soul image. A person who arrives not as a stranger, but as a carrier of something you've exiled from your own being. A vessel for your longing, a projection of the self. They show up not to complete you, but to reveal you. And when they arrive, it feels like something clicks, not just emotionally, architecturally, like your psyche recognizes a blueprint, a shape you didn't know your soul was hungry for until it was standing in front of you. It's tempting to call this fate, to say you were meant for each other, but the truth is more complex, more psychological, and far more dangerous. They were the materialization of something you were missing internally, and so you latched on, not just to them, but to what they represented. That's the power of projection. You don't fall in love with a person. You fall in love with the you they make possible. And maybe that's why it felt inevitable. Because before they ever appeared, you had already begun unconsciously preparing for them. The books you started reading, the music you suddenly resonated with, the dreams you couldn't quite make sense of. These weren't coincidences, they were psychological priming. Jung called this synchronicity, the alignment of internal states with external events. You don't find these people by chance. You find them because your soul is starving for them, and the unconscious finds a way to deliver. And when it does, it doesn't knock politely. It crashes in. It reorders your nervous system. It disrupts everything you thought you wanted, and it makes you remember things you never lived, but somehow always knew. That's the echo, the resonance, the eerie familiarity of someone you've never met but somehow recognize. You don't just meet them, you remember them, not as a past life fantasy or cosmic twin, but as the part of you that never got to speak. Before they arrived, you were already haunted by the sense that something essential had been cut off, a softness, a fire, a hunger, a voice. They didn't create it, they activated it. And now you're left trying to piece together the story backwards, trying to make meaning from the mess, trying to explain to yourself how someone could matter this much, when their role in your life was so brief, or so impossible, or so unfinished. But maybe they weren't meant to finish anything. Maybe they came to begin something, not a relationship, a reckoning. There's a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when you cross a threshold, when the person in front of you is no longer just a person, but a carrier of everything you've longed for, feared, suppressed, or abandoned. This is when it gets dangerous, because they are no longer just them. They've become a living symbol. You start to feel things that are disproportionate, irrational, electric. You notice every breath they take, every shift in tone, every word laced with meaning, even if it wasn't meant that way. Their presence alone feels medicinal. You crave them without understanding why, and that craving isn't just about touch or time. It's about access. Access to a part of yourself you didn't know was still alive. Jung wrote extensively about what happens when the unconscious is projected onto another. He called it a numinous experience, charged with energy, sacred, terrifying in its intensity. Because now, this person isn't just someone you like. They've become a stand-in for something far more intimate, your unlived life. And suddenly, every second around them feels like you're returning home. But it's not their home, it's yours. One you forgot existed. That's the collision. Not just of bodies or emotions, but of psychic architecture. The outer world meets the inner myth. And in that meeting, reality begins to bend. Time slows. Eye contact becomes a conversation in itself. Even silence feels thick with meaning. This isn't infatuation. This is activation. They awaken a need you didn't know how to name. A longing you thought you had killed in order to become functional. And now it's back. Wild, insistent, undeniable. Around them, your language changes. You speak from your gut. You confess things without the armor of coolness or restraint. It's not that they pull it out of you. It's that your defenses forget how to operate in their presence. But here's the tragic paradox. The more intense the projection, the more unstable the connection. Because you're not relating to who they are, you're relating to who they mean. And no human being, no matter how radiant, insightful, or soul-connected, can bear the weight of someone else's unconscious material for long. At first, it feels divine. Then, it starts to distort. You idealize, you analyze, you obsess. You start asking them silently, maybe even unconsciously, to carry something they never agreed to hold. And they feel it. They may not know what it is, but they sense the pressure. The way you look at them like they hold the key to your liberation. The way your eyes flicker with unspoken need. The way your presence vibrates with the question, will you save me from the parts of myself I can't reach alone? And this is where it begins to unravel. Not because the love wasn't real, but because it became too large to live inside the fragile walls of reality. You see, projection always wants to break the container. You can't control it. You can't contain it. You can only watch as it escalates until the bond either evolves or implodes. And in most cases, especially the impossible ones, it implodes. Not in anger, not in betrayal, in weight. The weight of everything you didn't know you were asking for. What you felt was real, but it wasn't all yours. And it wasn't all theirs either, because at some point, quietly, invisibly, the line blurred. You stopped seeing them and started seeing you, or rather the you that you had forgotten, avoided, suppressed, or never been allowed to become. That's projection. Jung didn't describe it as a flaw, but as a fact of being human. The psyche can't help but cast its inner world outward. We fall in love not with people, but with possibilities. Not with reality, but with reflections. And so when this person entered your life, they didn't just awaken attraction. They lit up an entire psychic complex, a cluster of emotion, memory, trauma, hope, fantasy. And it all collapsed onto them like a wave. You weren't just drawn to their eyes or voice or energy. You were drawn to the story they activated inside you. The story where you're finally understood, finally chosen, finally seen without distortion. In truth, they became a mirror. A stunning, aching mirror of everything you needed to reclaim. Your desire, projected. Your loneliness, projected. Your capacity for joy. Your deepest fears of abandonment. Your dormant creativity. Your unhealed wounds. Projected, not because you were foolish, but because you were ripe. Your unconscious had been building toward this moment. And this person, for reasons they may never understand, stepped right into the shape your soul had carved. You gave them a role in your inner mythology. Maybe the savior, maybe the sanctuary, maybe the one who would finally let you collapse without falling apart. And for a while, it worked. You both played your parts beautifully, even if neither of you knew what script you were in. But here's where the heartbreak starts. No one can sustain being a symbol. Eventually, the real person shows up. Not the soul image, not the mirror, but the flawed, limited, complex human being with their own wounds, blind spots, and boundaries. And when they fail to match the role you gave them, even in small ways, you feel it as betrayal. Not because they did something wrong, but because they broke the story you were projecting onto them. That's the hidden violence of projection. It turns a person into a screen for your unlived life. And when the movie stops playing, the grief feels existential. You weren't just in love with them. You were in love with what they unlocked, with the feeling of being alive again, of being whole. And when the spell breaks, it doesn't feel like waking up. It feels like being dropped, like falling back into the cold, sterile version of life you thought you'd escaped forever. You tell yourself they led you on. You obsess over what they did or didn't say, but underneath all that noise is a deeper pain. They held a piece of you you didn't know how to hold on your own. And now you're alone again, but not the same. Because now you've seen what's possible. Not just in them, but in you. And that's where the story begins to change. At some point, the connection hits a wall. It could be obvious: logistics, timing, distance, commitments. Or it could be subtle: a shift in energy, a hesitation that wasn't there before, a growing sense that something sacred is beginning to slip. You tell yourself it's bad luck, that the universe is cruel, that life got in the way, and maybe all of that is true. But beneath the circumstances lies something harder to name. Reality couldn't hold what the psyche projected. The weight of it becomes too much. You asked them, silently, unknowingly, to carry a whole archetype, to be your liberation, your salvation, your mirror, your muse. But they are human. They weren't built to hold that much of you. And maybe you weren't built to hold that much of them either. It's not that the love wasn't real. It's that the love required a kind of mythic stamina that reality doesn't afford. You start to feel it first in small ways. Communication falters. They seem tired around you, or confused, or cold. You try to fix it, soften yourself, get back to the intensity that once defined the beginning. But something has shifted, and no amount of care or charisma can return it. Because here's the truth most people won't say out loud. Sometimes the connection is too big to live. Not too dramatic, not too emotional, too sacred, too potent, too filled with unconscious material that hasn't yet been processed. These kinds of connections, the ones that hit you like revelations, they come before the self is ready. And so eventually, the connection collapses under its own psychic pressure. Maybe they ghost. Maybe you drift apart. Maybe you both try to keep it alive out of politeness or obligation. But deep down you know, it's gone. Not the memory, not the impact, but the living, breathing intimacy that once felt like it could remake your entire life. And that's when the spiral begins. You ask yourself, what did I do wrong? Did I come on too strong? Should I have played it cool? Was it even real for them? But none of those questions can touch the real pain. That the version of you that came alive around them has nowhere else to go. You don't just grieve them, you grieve the access they gave you to your own vitality, your own hunger, your own forgotten truth. And now, without them, you feel dimmed, unplugged, like a lighthouse with no one left to signal. Here's the hardest thing to accept. They may have loved you, they may still think of you, but love alone isn't enough. Not when the love lives in the unconscious, not when it threatens the stability of the life they've built, not when it asks both of you to become more than you're ready to be. These relationships fail not because they were false, but because they were too true. They cut too close to the bone. They exposed too much too fast. And sometimes the psyche, in its terror of transformation, slams the brakes. You were never rejected. You were overwhelming. Not in a way that means you should shrink, but in a way that means this version of you belongs to a different chapter, because this wasn't a failure, it was a threshold. And even if the relationship didn't survive, you still can. When it ends, whether with silence, distance, or a final goodbye, the first thing you feel isn't sadness, it's vacuum. The absence is not gentle, it howls. It lives in the gut, in the body, in the hours of the night you once shared, even just energetically. You wake up scanning for something you know isn't there anymore. They've left, but they're still inside you, still speaking in your dreams, still shaping your thoughts, still haunting the places you go in the hope, maybe unconsciously, that you'll bump into some version of them. But this isn't just missing a person, this is withdrawal. Psychologically, what's happening is a retraction of projection. The part of you that was living out there, in their eyes, their voice, their presence, is being forced to return home. And it doesn't come quietly. The mind begs for relief. What if I text them? What if they're thinking about me too? What if the timing just needs to shift? But underneath those thoughts is a deeper voice, quieter, harder to hear. You have to feel this now. Not distract, not reattach, feel. Because when you projected so much of your unlived self onto them, you unknowingly severed access to those parts of you. They held your tenderness, your imagination, your fire. They became a container for your shadow and your light. And now, it all comes flooding back. Unfiltered, unorganized, raw. This is why the grief feels so disproportionate. Because you're not just grieving them, you're grieving the temporary home you built for your soul inside someone else. And now that it's gone, your soul is trying to find its way back to you. It's a brutal process. You feel empty, then full of ache. You feel clear, then obsessed. You feel done, then plunged back into fantasy like it never ended. This is psychic detox. Your nervous system is trying to reorient without the external source that once regulated your emotional world. You may find yourself revisiting old patterns, reaching for distraction, scrolling past their social media, romanticizing the story to avoid the loneliness. But if you can stay with it, if you can let the ache without immediately trying to convert it into narrative, something begins to shift. Very slowly, the projection that once lived in them begins to take root in you. You remember that the qualities you loved most about them, their presence, their depth, their boldness, their capacity to see you, were mirrors. You felt them so intensely because they reflected what you had buried. That's the alchemy of withdrawal. The unbearable emptiness eventually becomes a vessel, and into that vessel, the psyche begins to pour what it once tried to outsource. You start to feel it one day, maybe months later. You hear a song and don't cry. You see their name and don't flinch. You remember something they said, and instead of spiraling, you smile. Because it changed you, not because they're gone, but because in their leaving, they returned you to yourself. This is the beginning of integration. Not the end of longing, but the end of disorientation. The moment the soul stops searching for them out there and starts rebuilding from within. Once the silence settles, another voice creeps in. Softer, persuasive, almost reasonable. Maybe you just need someone else. Not to erase them, just to distract you, to dull the ache, to prove you can still feel, to prove it wasn't that deep. This is the temptation, to find someone like them. Same energy, same eyes, same laugh, same spiritual buzz. Someone who carries the outline of what you lost, so you can pretend it never really left. But here's the truth your psyche already knows. You're not looking for someone new. You're looking for a replica. And what you'll find, again and again, is that replicas don't satisfy. They can't. because the connection wasn't about the person in isolation. It was about the pattern, the psychic signature, the projection, the meaning that person carried for you. So you go out, you swipe, you flirt, you find someone with similar traits, maybe even a closer logistical fit, and yet they don't ignite you. You feel numb, or restless, or weirdly guilty for not being able to transfer your affection onto this new person. Because your heart doesn't want a substitute, it wants resolution. But resolution doesn't come from moving on, it comes from moving inward. And this is where most people stop, because moving inward means confronting the truth. You projected your own potential onto someone else, and now you have to become what you once gave away. That's the deeper work, the kind of work that doesn't give you quick relief or romantic closure, but the kind that reconstructs your center. Because if you skip this stage, if you chase replacements without integration, you'll repeat the pattern. The ache will return, the names will change, but the emotional architecture will stay the same, and the wound will deepen, not from heartbreak, but from self-abandonment. So you stop. Not because you don't want love again, but because you realize love isn't the antidote. Wholeness is. That means sitting with the loneliness, letting it say what it needs to say, letting it stretch across your chest like a low, slow thunder, because underneath the craving for them, or for someone like them, is a deeper hunger to be reunited with the parts of yourself you once outsourced. And no one else can do that work for you, not even the next beautiful person who looks at you like they see the stars in your eyes. You can still let love in. Eventually, you will. But when you do, it won't be as an echo of what was. It will be from the ground you reclaimed. The you that emerged when you stopped running from the absence and started becoming the presence. At some point, the story stops being about them. You stop checking their name online. Stop tracing conversations back like forensic evidence. Stop replaying the last thing they said, hoping it reveals something you missed. Not because you stopped caring, but because you started transmuting. This is where grief becomes alchemy, where projection becomes integration, where longing becomes embodiment. You begin to ask a different question. Not why did they leave? Not why couldn't it work? But what exactly did they awaken in me that I now refuse to lose? That question changes everything. Because now the work isn't about finding them again. It's about finding you. You look at the traits that captivated you. Maybe it was their depth, their emotional courage, their way of making you feel alive without trying. Maybe it was the softness in their voice or the way their mind danced with yours. Maybe it was their ability to hold contradictions, to be fierce and tender, clear and mysterious, rooted and wild. And then it hits you. All of that lives in me too, otherwise you wouldn't have recognized it. Jung believed that what we fall in love with is a symbol, an image from our own unconscious that we've projected outward. So when you loved them, you were loving the image of something you were ready to reclaim. This is what makes the loss so paradoxical. You never really had them, but you absolutely had the experience, and that experience revealed a map, a psychic path, a blueprint of your next becoming, so you start following it, not toward them, but toward yourself. You take back the parts of you that you assigned to their presence. You let yourself be the one who creates softness, the one who holds space, the one who radiates mystery and fire and clarity. You stop waiting for someone to show you who you are and start becoming the one who knows. This doesn't mean the love fades. It means the love evolves from external obsession to internal devotion, from fantasy to form, from longing to practice. You carry them now, not as a ghost, not as a regret, but as a guidepost, as a symbol of your own potential. a living imprint of who you are when you stop hiding, and slowly you feel it. You don't need them to return to feel whole, because they were never the missing piece. They were the mirror that showed you the pieces you already had. The inner union begins not when you forget them, but when you integrate what they revealed. When the qualities you admired become verbs you live. When the energy that once overwhelmed you becomes the soil you root in. And that's when the ache starts to shift. Not because it disappears, but because it no longer rules you. It becomes part of your story, part of your shape, part of the person you are now, not because they stayed, but because they came at all. There comes a moment, not dramatic, not cinematic, where you stop asking, will they come back? And you start asking, why did they come at all? Not in a bitter way, not as self-pity, but as a kind of sacred curiosity. Because if they weren't here to stay, then maybe they were here to say something. Jung often spoke of the soul using symbols when it can't speak directly. Dreams, synchronicities, sudden, inexplicable relationships that leave your inner world forever altered. And maybe that's what this person was. Not a partner, not a forever, but a symbolic event. A message in human form. When you stop clinging to the literal, the texts, the timeline, the logistics, and start paying attention to the archetype, everything changes. You see how they arrived exactly when your soul was ready for rupture, how their presence coincided with a question you'd been too afraid to ask. What do I really want? Who have I become? What have I abandoned? And suddenly it makes sense. The intensity, the timing, the impossibility. They weren't a mistake. They were a mirror held up by the unconscious saying, look, this is the version of you you've been avoiding. This is your unlived life in skin and voice and heartbeat. And then, because symbols are not meant to stay, they vanished. That's the ache. But it's also the assignment. You weren't meant to live in the dream. You were meant to wake up from it with your hands full of its meaning. Because this kind of love, the kind that burns bright and brief and deep, is rarely a destination. It's a messenger, not to tell you who your soulmate is, but to show you where your soul still needs tending. So instead of asking, how do I get them back? You start asking, what part of me did they activate that I've now been tasked with embodying? That's when the grief transforms, not into joy, not into closure, but into presence. They are no longer a person you lost. They are a symbol you carry, a reminder of what it felt like to be awake, and an invitation to never go back to sleep. You don't forget them. That's not how this ends. This doesn't wrap in a bow. It doesn't click shut like a completed chapter, because they were never just a person. They were a doorway. And doorways don't close once you've walked through them. They become part of the architecture, part of the house your life now lives in. The ache doesn't disappear, but it stops being a wound and starts being a root, something that grounds you in a deeper understanding of who you are. That's what integration is. It's not forgetting. It's not moving on in the way the world tells you to, with a clean break and a cheerful rebound. It's weaving the pain, the beauty, the intensity, the collapse into your fabric, so it no longer lives outside you as something that haunts, but inside you as something that formed. You begin to live differently, not more carefully, but more consciously, more honestly, because once you've been undone by a connection like that, you can't go back to sleepwalking. You can't pretend you don't want to be seen. You can't pretend you're fine with half versions of love. You can't pretend your soul doesn't ache for realness. And so you start to show up, not for them, but for you. You become more aware of what you feel, what you need, what you won't collapse yourself to accommodate anymore. You let tenderness guide you instead of shame. You stop waiting for permission to take up emotional space. You stop mistaking fantasy for fate. And maybe most importantly, You stop assuming that your depth is too much to carry alone, because now you know that depth is yours. It was never theirs to sustain. They just reminded you it existed, and now it's your turn to hold it, to care for it, to build a life, a real, rooted, ordinary, miraculous life that doesn't depend on anyone arriving to save you, but welcomes whoever is ready to meet you. Not in the mirror of projection, but in the clear light of reality. That's how the story ends. Not with reunion, not with revenge, but with return to yourself, to your wholeness, to the you who survived the rupture and made something sacred out of its remains. Because they didn't come to complete you, they came to remind you you were never missing.